Hello, chess fans. Today's game is my number 9 best chess game of the 2000s. While today Magnus Carlsen is known as a positional chess genius, when he was developing for this game and others, he was considered a tactical genius and was nicknamed the Mozart of chess. This game was played in 2004 when Magnus was only 13 years old and was traveling Europe trying to get a game with every grandmaster that he could find. Now, this tournament was the Weichensee C group. Magnus would win this tournament and eventually win the B group and then the A group, which was one of the greatest super tournaments that there is. I remember watching this game live and seeing the buzz in the chess press about this game and this young player who we now know is one of the greatest chess players of all time. The young Magnus opened up the game with pawn to e4, and Sipke Ernst responded with pawn to c6. Now, today Magnus is not known for entering main lines, but as a young player, he, like most young players, was studying chess nonstop, so he was booked up and he does follow the main line. He's expanding with the h-pawn, typical of the Caro-Kann, and you have this interesting situation here where you're trying to figure out if the h-pawn is space gaining and strong for white, or if it's a target and weak. I have found in general that when I'm playing black, it's a strong space gaining pawn, and when I'm playing white, it's weak, and I'm going to lose the pawn and eventually lose the endgame. Now, this bishop on h7 is too strong, so we must play to exchange it, which Magnus does, and then both players play a series of very natural moves here, and then white plays knight to e4, a bit of a surprising move for me because black could have traded a pair of knights, which made some sense, and Magnus did say that after a trade of knights here, knight f6, and then the queen falls back, queen d5, he wanted to offer a pawn sacrifice. He's hit here, and he's hit over here on h5, but if he just moves his king after knight takes h5, he said, I have good compensation, which fair enough. This would have been a totally different game, and it would have been a very interesting one if the game had gone this way. Instead, though, Ernst played the move queen to a5. He's also playing in this line after the a2 pawn and the h5 pawn, but here you really can't even choose to take that pawn. After king b1, if you play knight takes h5, Carlsen's going to get a big advantage with knight d6 check. You need to trade off that knight. And then you've got a seatbelt here, so you can't castle. And if you castle queenside instead of kingside, knight e5 is really strong. You're interrupting the coordination here of the queen and the knight on the 5th rank. And after an exchange here of the knights on e5, you can pull the knight to safety, but only at the cost of losing multiple pawns and being left with a super passive and bad position for black. So in the game, Ernst said after king b1, time to castle, so he did so, and Magnus traded once here on f6, which allows him to bring the knight to e5 without allowing a trade. This knight is obviously wonderful, and it also supports g4 with an initiative on the king side in this opposite side's castling position. Rook ad8 is also natural from Ernst, lining up where the queen is and thinking about c5. Now g4 is supernatural here, but it's so natural that it was played in a Super GM game prior to this, an Anand game, and Carlsen said, well, I knew this game, but I also figured it's so famous that he would know it too, and I didn't want him to be able to play, theoretical stuff where he wasn't thinking for himself. So at this point, Magnus leaves the book. He plays queen to e2, which steps off of the unpleasant line on the d file here, and this move creates a drop of poison. If Ernst had spotted the poison in the position, he should have played queen to b6, attacking d4, and after d4 is defended, pawn to c5 gets the desired pawn break and positions the queen perfectly for defense. And Ernst would have been fine here. He's equalizing the game. However, after queen e2, he didn't see this, and he immediately played pawn to c5. Again, the desired pawn break, but now Magnus has a huge blow. Knight to g6. Boom! This is a tremendous move. It is absolutely a shot heard around the chess world. I certainly remember Loving this at the time and seeing the chess media just absorbed with discussion of this beautiful game won by this 13-year-old, recalling the brilliant game of the century that Bobby Fischer won at the same age. Now, after knight g6, Black doesn't have to and really should not accept the sacrificed knight, but if you choose not to, because you're hit here and here, your only choice is rook over to e8. But after rook f to e8 here, you're going to trade on e7, and white secures a big but not necessarily winning advantage by taking on c5. You can't take back right away because your rook is hanging, so you would say, let me trade rooks, and now I'll take on c5. But still, it was too early to grab that pawn back. Bishop d6, a little bishop fork, and Carlsen would just win the game on the spot. So, faced with an unpleasant option in declining the knight sacrifice, Ernst did choose to capture here on g6. Well, the point is that e6 is now undefended. That's the main idea behind queen e2, and would have been why queen b6 would have been a good response before playing c5. Now, after queen takes e6 check here, Black has really only one semi-plausible choice. Rook f7 is immediately losing to taking here, pressure on the pinned piece. And if you play king h7 here, then capturing on g6 is just a stronger version of the game, because if king takes here, you have lots of good options, including taking here, and lifting the rook is even better, according to Stockfish, multiple ways to win the game. So, after queen takes e6 check, Ernst does play the strongest defensive move, which is king to h8. And a key point here is that you cannot play queen takes e7 because of knight d5. You're hit here, and Ernst has neutralized this brewing attack in this position. So, after king h8, Magnus plays pawn takes on g6. So he's willing to stay a piece down for a moment, but he's obviously got huge threats in this position. The answer to most responses from Black is basically, I'm going to sacrifice on h6, and Black just doesn't have a good way to deal with that. For example, here, if you want to defend e7, you can choose to defend with a rook, but all of the rook choices are bad. This one's the worst one, because after a sacrifice here, you're allowed to get to f7, which is crushing. We're threatening rook takes h6, g7, and if the knight moves, then we can also mate on h7. So you might think, let me choose the other rook. I will play rook over here, and you can't have h7, but white is still winning in this case. For example, bishop takes h6, and after g takes h6, we can pull back to e3. We didn't need the f7 square. We have a different way into this position. Of course, knight g8, choosing to defend, and rook takes h6 is really strong. There's a lot of sacrificial lines here, and I'm not going to see them all the way to the end. Also, rook d7 leads to a line that Magnus mentioned. If rook d7 defending more along the 7th rank, which is the vulnerable rank here, then bishop takes, g takes, rook takes h6, king g7, simply rook d to h1, intending rook h7 is a crushing attack for Magnus. Faced with all of these unpleasant options, we do see a really nice defensive try from Ernst. That is the retreating move, knight to g8. This move defends h6 and e7, so it seems like this should be the perfect solution to Black's woes. Unfortunately, we can still sacrifice our way to glory for white. Bishop takes h6, boom again, another hammer blow from Magnus Carlsen. Now you have two possible captures here. If you take with the knight, this is the easier path for white because you just sacrifice the rook. Black can only take that. And after queen take, it doesn't matter that Black has an extra rook because white's queen dominates this 7th rank, and you cannot defend against queen to h7 and checkmate. It is a forced mate in 4, even against Black's most desperate defenses. So, after bishop takes h6, we do see the pawn capture on h6 instead, but again, we're going to see a rook sacrifice. Rook takes h6. Of course, in this position, if the king were to move, we have a simple rook h7, golf clap please. Very, very nice checkmate here. But of course, too simple. Ernst isn't going to go for that. So after rook takes h6, we do see knight takes h6, and again, queen takes e7. It looks again like we're just mating here on h7, but in this particular move order, there is a resource available to Ernst. It is knight to f7, blocking here that 7th rank and defending for a moment the threats there. And again, black is up a knight and a rook at the moment. Now, one really interesting thing about this game is that up to this point, it had been played before. And the black player was a young Jan Gustafsson, head of Chess 24 today. And Magnus is currently Jan Gustafsson's boss. So a possible title for this video is Magnus Shows Who's the Boss. So in that game that featured Gustafsson playing black, black actually got a draw. Now Magnus says he didn't know this game at the time, but in that game after queen f6 check, king g8, white played rook to h1, saying, hey, I'm just going to take here and then I'm going to mate here. But probably he had missed knight h6 that Gustafsson played. You can't take here because you've got a back rank mate hanging down here. Faced with the surprise here of realizing that he had to worry about the back rank mate, white actually ended up going for a perpetual by playing the queen to e7, the knight blocked, and the queen and knight simply shifted. The game actually ended with queen f6, knight h6, queen e7, knight f7, ending in this position. Now, I just revealed that actually there was a stronger move after knight f7. White could still have won after a repetition by playing the rook up along the 5th rank here. Black actually doesn't have a reasonable improving move in this position, and we're going to take here and we're able to introduce the rook into the attack with decisive effect. But that was missed, and that game did end in a draw. And again, Magnus said that he did not know that game before this game. So after knight f7, Magnus improves on that game by playing g takes f7 here. And now his idea is very simple. I'm just going to introduce the rook, and my rook and queen are going to overrun your pieces and checkmate the black king. It doesn't matter that you have an extra rook. They're totally irrelevant in this position. Now, in this position, we do see king g7 from black, anticipating the introduction of the rook along the h-file. So the rook finds a more active way to get involved. It is rook d3 here, preparing to introduce the rook on g3 with this rook lift. Now the queen can't mate back here because white's queen is perfectly placed, defending that e1 square. So this rook tries to defend along the 6th rank. There's nothing better. Rook g3 now, and rook g6 blocking the check. Again, there's a number of different options available to black throughout here, but always the white rook and queen are overwhelming and are delivering checkmate. After rook g6 here, we do see queen to e5 check. If king h6, we have an immediate mate, rook h3, golf clap again, right? And if king h7, which looks a little bit better here, now you don't want to check here right away because after queen h5 check, rook h6, actually it does work. You can still do this. In some lines, you can actually improve by checking from a different square, but queen h5 check is strongest here. And then we're just going to swing the queen over and introduce her to g7 and checkmate. So after queen e5 check, black did take on f7, and then queen f5 check, getting ready to pick up this rook over here. If you try king to e7, you can't take the rook right away because black has mate down here, but you just throw rook e3 check in, and then you can pick up the rook, or maybe the other rook, and in any case, you're going to have a huge attack and you're going to win more material soon. So after queen f5 check, black decided to block with rook f6, which meant that the game actually finished with queen d7 checkmate and an epaulet mate. Probably one of the more famous finishing positions from the decade of the 2000s. I hope that you enjoyed that game. If you did, please do check out the playlist with more of the top 10 best chess games of the 2000s sitting on top of the chessboard, and have an amazing day.